He found her in the wreckage, pregnant and dying. Her last request, please save my baby. They called it a wedding, but for her it was more like a transaction. Her name was Irian, and though her people once lived among crystal towers and soft-lighted cities suspended in the misted skies of Valura Prime, that world had long since been reduced to ash and twisted metal. War didn't just break buildings, it rewrote lives, rerouted destinies. And Irian's destiny had been decided the moment her homeworld became a military checkpoint. She was 17 when they came, men in uniforms that didn't match, armed with rifles older than the war itself, yet deadly in their hands. They weren't invaders, technically. The soldiers were from her own planet's defense force, now splintered and privatized into warbands, mercenaries pretending to be patriots. They took control of the refugee zones, offering protection in exchange for obedience. One of them, Commander Karth Ven, decided Irian would become his wife. He didn't ask. Karth was a powerful man among the ranks, known more for cruelty than strategy. He had the kind of confidence that comes from being feared, not respected. Older than her by at least 2 decades, his voice was always calm, but it hit a temper that snapped like a wire pulled too tight. At first, she thought maybe the marriage would give her safety. Maybe if she followed the rules, he'd leave her alone. But rules didn't matter to men like him. She quickly learned that silence wasn't safety, it was submission. Still, she endured it. Because what else was there? Her parents had died in the first bombardment. Her younger brother, Laris, disappeared during an evacuation, one moment clutching her hand, the next swallowed by a crush of bodies and smoke. For a while, she searched. Every week she asked around, chased rumors, cried in places where no one could hear. But it was like the world had simply taken him and shrugged. Eventually she stopped asking. Everyone did. That was when she met Karth Ven. He wasn't the worst man she'd ever seen. In fact, the first time she met him, she actually mistook him for someone decent. He brought her a warm meal, real meat, not processed paste, and didn't ask anything in return. Not that day. Not even the next. He had that military bearing, that calm, clipped way of speaking that made people think he was in control. To a girl who had lost everything, that kind of certainty felt like safety. But safety has a price, and Karth didn't hide his interest for long. The camp had its own twisted hierarchy, and Karth was near the top. A former squad commander turned freelance enforcer, he ran supplies and guarded territory for one of the larger resistance warbands. No one challenged him, and when he declared he was taking a wife, no one questioned it. He gave her a necklace and called it a gift, then a ring and called it a vow. But nothing he offered ever really felt like it belonged to her. She wasn't allowed to say no. The wedding was more ceremony than consent, a formality wrapped in smiles that didn't reach anyone's eyes. The efficient red lines from an old planetary charter declaring unity under protection, while soldiers watched in silence. Afterward, Karth pressed a kiss to her forehead and said, "Now no one will ever hurt you again." She felt her skin crawl. At first, he kept up appearances. She had a bed, clean even, hot food, warm clothes, but it didn't take long before the control crept in. Little things, how she spoke, what she wore, when she could leave the quarters, and with whom. The first time she raised her voice, he didn't even shout back. He just looked at her, cold and calm, and said, "You're forgetting who feeds you." That was the beginning. Karth never hit her. He didn't have to. His power was in silence, in proximity. He'd sit too close, speak too softly, smile when she flinched. He used her past like a weapon, bringing up her dead family, the brother who vanished, the friends who left her behind, reminding her that he was the only one still there. And slowly she began to believe it. That maybe this was the best she could hope for. That in a broken world, survival was love. Then she found out she was pregnant. She told no one. Not even him. Especially not him. For a while it gave her something to hold on to. Something that was hers. When the camp grew loud and the night brought screams from tents nearby, she would press her hand to her stomach and whisper to the life growing inside her. She promised warmth, safety, something better. Karth wouldn't be part of that future, but she didn't yet know how she'd escape. Then the outpost was attacked. The sirens didn't even go off in time. Drones cut through the clouds like razors, and within seconds the first barrage hit. She had been outside the walls, sent to trade for medicine. From the ridge, she saw the fire bloom, felt the shock wave rattle her teeth. By the time she ran back, there was nothing left but cratered earth and shadows burned into the concrete. No bodies, just scorched ground and silence. Karth was gone. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stood there in the ash, the wind pushing her hair across her face, and felt nothing. And that terrified her more than anything else. For 3 days, she wandered what remained of the camp. No one came looking. No one remembered her name. The system that once kept track of rations and quarters had burned with the command tower. Without Karth, she was invisible. The relief came slowly, like a fever breaking. She could breathe again. She didn't flinch at shadows. She didn't whisper permission before entering a room. But freedom, she soon realized, was a shallow bowl when filled with hunger and no future. She was 6 months pregnant, alone, and the war was never going to end. So it was during one of those bleak, rain-laced nights, one of those quiet, sleepless hours between midnight and morning, that she sat beneath a rusted canopy and stared out into the drenched wasteland and made her decision. She would leave, not because she thought it would work, but because staying meant dying, and her child deserved more than that. She remembered the sound the door made when it sealed shut, an ugly mechanical clunk, like a prison locking from the outside. That was the last time she saw the stars from within the freighter. Irian hadn't expected comfort. She hadn't even dared to hope for safety. But still, the inside of the smuggler's ship scraped away whatever illusions she had left. The metal walls were rust-streaked and slick with condensation. The air smelled like engine grease and something sour, like food gone bad. There were no seats, no beds, just crates bolted into the floor, and a tangled nest of rags and wires where the 16 of them were told to sit and not move. No one asked her name. No one offered theirs. These weren't refugees trying to build community. They were survivors, just like her, worn down to the bone and wary of anyone who made eye contact for too long. People who'd had everything stolen from them, and maybe had stolen something themselves just to keep going. For the first few hours, they said nothing. A man coughed dryly in the back, and an older woman clutched a bag that jingled like metal when she shifted her weight. A child cried once, but was quickly hushed by a shaking mother. Irian kept her hands folded over her stomach and her eyes low, listening to the thrum of the ship and waiting for some announcement, some sign that they were moving towards something better. But no one ever said Valera again. The silence broke when the drop began. It came without warning, just a violent jerk that sent her body sideways into a crate corner. Someone screamed. Alarms blared, and through the thin metal wall, she could hear the roar of the atmosphere shredding against the hull. She braced herself for impact, but it didn't come, not like she expected. There was no smooth descent, no landing protocol, just a sharp lurch and a gut-twisting jolt that knocked half the passengers unconscious. When she opened her eyes again, the ship wasn't flying anymore. It was groaning, creaking like an old house trying not to collapse. Then the hatch unsealed, and the light outside hit like a hammer. Not the soft, golden light of Valera, not even the cracked haze of her ruined homeworld. This was something else. This was Zamira. She didn't know the planet by name, not yet, but the moment the scent hit her nostrils, she knew. This wasn't a colony, it was a graveyard. The wind stung like acid. The air had a dry, metallic taste that clung to her teeth. The landscape was a cracked sea of gray dust, broken only by jagged pillars of twisted machinery and wreckage half buried beneath the sand. Everything was either dead or trying very hard to look like it. They'd been left here. No one came to explain. No one apologized. The freighter lifted off again, its engines roaring to life, and just like that, it was gone. Vanished into the clouds like it had never existed. One moment, there was the illusion of escape. The next, just dust and silence. Irian didn't speak. Couldn't speak. Someone cried out. An older man screaming, waving his fists at the sky, shouting obscenities in a language she didn't know. Another woman collapsed onto her knees, sobbing with such force that her whole body trembled. No one tried to stop them. Everyone else was too stunned, too shattered to do anything more than breathe. That first night, they found shelter in the shell of a half-buried mining rig. It was rusted through, barely standing, but it had 4 walls and something resembling a roof. Inside, it was dark and hot, the air thick with dust and old chemicals. They took turns checking the remaining crates salvaged from the freighter: water pods, emergency meal packs, a small solar stove, rations for maybe 4 days if they stretched. Irian drifted in and out of consciousness for the first 2 days. Her body, pushed past its limits for weeks, now seemed unsure whether to heal or give up. She faded through moments of darkness and pale light, always accompanied by the same voice. Calm, steady, warm in a way she couldn't quite believe was real. "Vitals are holding," he would say. "Pressure's low, but we're stabilizing." Sometimes she heard him curse quietly under his breath, followed by the gentle hiss of medical foam or the soft click of a scanner. Sometimes he simply sat near her, saying nothing at all, but he was always there. When she finally came to fully, the room was dimmed. The lights softened to avoid overwhelming her retinas. The sheets beneath her were impossibly smooth. The beeping from the machines beside her was steady, calming, like a synthetic heartbeat. Her own body felt heavy, but the pain was dull now, distant, manageable. For the first time in what felt like years, she wasn't cold. She turned her head slowly, and there he was, sitting in a chair beside her bed, elbows on knees, fingers laced together. His expression wasn't guarded like the soldiers she'd known. It was tired but open. Watching her, studying her as if trying to understand what she'd endured. His name was Paul, Commander Paul Rayner, according to the badge clipped to his collar. Human, mid-30s, maybe a little older. Worn around the edges like a favorite jacket, but solid, present in a way that made people instinctively lean toward him. His uniform was plain, save for a few faded patches that looked like they had stories behind them. He hadn't shaved in a few days. His hair was short, the kind that always seemed stuck between neat and wild, and his eyes, gray-blue like storm clouds, held something more than curiosity. They held guilt, as if her suffering somehow reflected something broken in him too. "You're awake," he said gently, voice lower than she expected. "Took you long enough." His smile was small, almost reluctant. Irian tried to respond, but her throat felt like it was lined with sand. She gave a faint nod instead, blinking slowly as she tried to orient herself. "You're safe," he said, reaching for the water tube beside her bed. "You're on our ship, research vessel Artemis, Earth Registry. You've been unconscious for about 40 hours. We've been keeping you stable." He helped guide the water to her lips. Cool liquid touched her tongue, and for a moment she almost cried at the sensation. "Just a sip. Your system's still fragile." She drank what she could, then slumped back against the pillow. Her hand drifted to her stomach, fingers trembling. "Your baby's okay," Paul said before she could even ask. "We've been monitoring everything. Strong heartbeat, stable vitals. You held on longer than most would have." Irian closed her eyes and swallowed hard. Relief flooded her in a wave so strong it almost hurt. She opened them again slowly, taking him in once more. "Thank you," she croaked, her voice hoarse and cracked. "You don't have to thank me," he replied, standing to adjust something on the monitor. "I was just in the right place at the right time." But he hadn't just been in the right place. He'd picked her up, carried her like she mattered, like she wasn't just one more ruined thing in a ruined world. That wasn't luck. That was choice. He visited her every day after that, sometimes twice. He always entered quietly, often bringing something warm to drink or a data pad with old Earth music he said might help her sleep. The rest of the crew stayed busy managing the other survivors and the ship's operations, but Paul always found time to sit with her. In the first days, he did most of the talking. He told her how Artemis was part of a science fleet surveying dead planets for signs of regrowth potential. Zamira had been a side detour. Some odd energy signal drew them in. They hadn't expected to find people. Certainly not what he called a full humanitarian disaster on a ghost world. He told her about Earth, not the politics or the big cities, but small things. Growing up near the mountains, sneaking out to watch meteor showers as a kid, a sister who taught him how to throw a punch when he was 10, A father who used to work in shipyards and always smelled like oil and burnt metal. When she was strong enough to sit upright, she asked, "Why do you stay?" He blinked, caught off guard. "You mean on this ship?" She nodded. He leaned back in the chair, scratching the back of his neck. "Because I couldn't sit still. Earth was quiet after the war. Too quiet. I needed something. Something to fight for, I guess. Even if it's just broken planets." He looked at her then, long and searching. "Why did you stay?" The question hung in the air between them. She didn't answer right away. The next day she did. It started in pieces, halting, unsure. But once the words began, they poured out like floodwaters through a cracked dam. She told him about her homeworld, about Vailura, the city of glass towers and floating gardens, the family she lost, her brother's hand slipping from hers, the refugee camps, the silence, the fear. She told him about Karth, never saying his name, just him. The man who married her without asking, who gave her food and took her freedom, who controlled her with calm threats and careful violence. Paul didn't interrupt. He didn't offer pity or outrage. He just listened. She told him how Karth died, how she didn't feel anything, and that scared her more than grief. She described the fire, the crater, the wind in her hair, and the silence where a man used to bark orders. And finally, she told him about the freighter, the cold metal hold, the panic, the lies. When she finished, Paul sat in silence for a while, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he understood that sometimes silence was the only honest answer. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice quiet. "No one should have to go through that." She gave a tired smile, eyes glassy. "A lot of people have. I'm not special." Paul shook his head. "You're wrong. You survived. That is special." The days bled together after that, but they were no longer bleak. There was rhythm now. She began walking, slowly at first, along the corridors of Artemis. The others, refugees like her, occupied their own quarters, resting, recovering. Some still didn't speak. Others started forming bonds, however tentative. Trauma recognizes itself. But Paul always returned to her. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they played old Earth board games he retrieved from the archive just to see if she'd smile. Once, he brought her a small projection sphere filled with holographic stars. "So you don't forget what you're heading toward," he said. She asked about his life more often now, about his first assignment on a Mars outpost, and how it ended in disaster after a supply ship miscalculated orbit. About the girl he was once engaged to. "A long time ago," he said, voice distant. "We weren't built for the same life." He told her about the crew, how most were scientists, not soldiers, how half of them had volunteered for this mission because they'd lost people too. And she started laughing again, quietly, not often, but real. Her body was healing, her spirit too, though it took longer. Paul noticed the way she moved now, less like someone ready to collapse, and more like someone beginning to believe in her own survival. She wasn't just alive anymore. She was becoming whole. One night, as they sat in the observation deck, watching a nebula drift past the glass, she turned to him and asked, "Do you believe people can change?" He looked at her, really looked. "I think the right people help us remember who we were before the world broke us." She didn't answer. She just leaned her head on his shoulder, and he didn't move. That night she dreamed not of war, but of light, and in the distance a voice, steady, familiar, whispering, "You're not alone anymore." That was the first night she believed it might be true. The stars had started to look less like distant fires and more like scattered memories. In the days that followed her recovery, the rhythm of Irian's life aboard Artemis became strangely comforting, almost peaceful in its routine. Meals were on time. The hallways were quiet. The air didn't sting her lungs. The ship hummed gently around her, like it was cradling her instead of confining her. After everything she had survived, this place, cold metal, strange tech, artificial light, should have felt foreign. But with Paul nearby, it felt something closer to safe. And with each passing day, that feeling grew stronger. Paul had a quiet way about him. He never made her feel like a patient, or worse, a project. He never hovered, never pressed for more than she was ready to give. Sometimes he brought tea, sometimes a story, sometimes nothing at all. Just his calm presence. Something solid in a universe that still felt mostly hollow to her. Their conversations deepened like water pooling in a dry place. It began with shared silences, then small truths, then laughter. Surprising, unguarded laughter that felt like it didn't belong to her, but someone she used to be. That someone was beginning to return. One afternoon, they were in the greenhouse module, surrounded by artificially grown greenery and glowing fruit pods. Paul had shown her how to pollinate the flowering vines that provided part of the crew's oxygen. It had become their quiet ritual, something mindless, hands-on, earthy, something not ruined by war. He handed her a set of nutrient tools and she took them with a soft smile. "I don't know if I'm helping or just in the way," she said. Paul wiped soil from his hands on a rag tucked in his belt. "You're helping. You've got a better touch than some of my actual botanists." "Really?" "Number. But you look less miserable doing it." She laughed, the sound catching her off guard. "Fair." He leaned against one of the growth pods, folding his arms. "You're smiling more." "I am," she admitted. "It's strange." "What's strange about it?" She tilted her head, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I didn't think I'd smile again. Not like this. Not where it feels real." Paul didn't speak right away. Then, "That's a good thing. It means you're healing." "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just forgetting." He looked at her then, really looked. "You don't have to forget. You just don't have to live there anymore." That stayed with her for the rest of the day, and the one after that. But not every moment between them was gentle. One evening, just days from Earth, tension found its way in like a crack in a pressure seal. It started innocently. She was packing the few belongings she had, folding each item with a quiet sort of finality. Paul had walked in, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, expression unreadable. "You're organizing already?" he asked. She nodded. "I don't want to waste time when we land. I need to be ready." "For what?" "To go." He hesitated, watching her for a long beat. "You're not staying?" She paused, her back still to him. "I can't. I don't belong there. With your people. With you." There was silence behind her. She hated how heavy it felt. "You do belong," Paul said finally, voice low. "You just don't believe it yet." She turned, eyes sharp. "You don't know that." "I know enough," he said, stepping closer. "I know you're strong, smarter than you give yourself credit for. And I know you've been through hell and still managed to care for people around you. That's more than most can say." "I'm not your responsibility," she said quickly, defensively. "I never said you were. But you look at me like I'm some broken thing you need to fix." "No," Paul said firmly, his voice cutting through her panic. "I look at you like someone I care about. Deeply. Maybe more than I should. But not because you're broken. Because you're still here." The room felt suddenly too small, too bright, too full of emotion. Irian didn't know whether to scream or run or cry. "I'm not ready for that," she whispered. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Paul stepped forward, closing the space between them until he was just within reach. "Then let me help you remember. Not for me, for you." She searched his eyes, expecting to find pity, but there was none. Just sincerity, just Paul. "I can't promise anything," she said. "I'm not asking you to." There was a beat of silence, heavy and charged. Then he touched her hand, slowly, gently, his fingers brushing hers like a question. She didn't pull away. Instead, her hand turned, palm to palm, and their fingers intertwined. She breathed in, shaky and uncertain. "This is foolish." "Maybe," he said, leaning in. "But it feels right." And then he kissed her. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was quiet and deliberate, tender in a way that made her knees threaten to give out. It felt like a promise, not of something perfect, but of something possible. His lips were warm, his touch steady, and when he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. They stood like that for a long time, not speaking. When she opened her eyes again, she saw something in him she hadn't allowed herself to recognize before. Not duty, not obligation, choice. The he was choosing her, and somewhere deep inside, beneath all the fear and fatigue and scars, she wanted to choose him too. They didn't sleep together that night. There was no rush toward intimacy, just the kind of closeness that doesn't need to prove itself. He sat beside her in her quarters, reading quietly while she rested with her head on his shoulder. Now and then, he glanced down at her, and she'd close her eyes, pretending not to notice. But she always did. She dreamed of water, a lake, a quiet child playing at the shore, and Paul sitting beside her, holding the child's hand. When she woke, tears were already on her cheeks. But this time, they weren't from pain. They were from hope. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe, truly believe, that something beautiful might still come from everything she'd lost. Earth hit her like a shockwave, one she wasn't prepared for, no matter how many times Paul had tried to explain what to expect. She had imagined beauty, yes. She had heard stories of blue skies and clean cities, of forests so vast they stretched beyond vision, and oceans that shimmered under twin moons. But imagination fell short. It didn't prepare her for the sheer intensity of the place, the riot of colors, the noise of it, the chaotic movement of so many people in so many directions. It was more than overwhelming. It was alien in its own right. For Irian, it was like stepping out of a grave and finding the world still spinning without her. She remembered that first breath of Earth's atmosphere as the landing bay doors slid open and warm air filled the shuttle cabin. Not artificial, not filtered through machines or recycled from metallic ducts, but alive. Rich with scents she didn't have names for yet. Pollen, wet stone, open water, and some kind of spice in the wind that reminded her of stories her mother once told. She hadn't even realized she was crying until Paul gently brushed his thumb along her cheek and murmured, "You're home now." But she didn't feel like she belonged. Not at first. The terminal buzzed with humans speaking in languages she didn't know, with laughter and screens flashing announcements and children chasing after rolling luggage bots. She stood in the middle of it all, still wrapped in the neutral-tone cloak Paul had given her on the ship, and felt the weight of eyes, even if they weren't looking. He never left her side. He spoke softly, letting her move at her own pace. Sometimes she simply stopped and closed her eyes just to ground herself in the sound of his voice, calm and steady. Not instructing, not ordering, just being. He took her hand when she froze near the security arch, her body instinctively tensing as she saw armed officers in uniform. She didn't realize she was holding her breath until Paul leaned in and whispered, "They're not here to hurt you." That was the first time she believed him without hesitation. Outside, the city towered in all directions. It was different from the places she'd seen through old transmission feeds or pixelated history files. There were trees growing between glass buildings, sky-rail trains that moved like serpents of light through the air, people laughing in parks, vendors selling strange, fragrant foods on corners, the aroma so rich it made her stomach ache. She clutched Paul's coat as they walked down the ramp and felt small, but not invisible, not anymore. His family lived on the outskirts of a coastal settlement named Orion Reach. Not the biggest, not the most famous, but nestled between the cliffs and the forests in a way that felt quiet, grounded. The shuttle ride there was long and filled with silences, but not the heavy kind. She watched the ocean ripple beneath them through the window, her reflection half mirrored in the glass. Eyes softer now, skin healing, a life still tucked safely inside her womb. When they landed, his family was waiting. Irian had expected polite distance. She braced herself for the kind of smiles that didn't reach the eyes, for whispered concerns about her species, her past, the child that wasn't Paul's. But what she got was warmth, real, human warmth. Paul's mother hugged her before she even got a full sentence out. His sister, tall and bold with wind-tangled hair and a voice like a song, grinned at her and said, "You don't have to be anything but who you are here." They didn't ask for her story. They simply made space for her. That first night, she slept in a real bed, under real blankets, in a room with a window that opened to clean air and the rustle of leaves. She had never known quiet like that. It wasn't empty. It was full, with life, with possibility. Paul slept on the floor beside her despite her protests. You've had enough men making choices for you, he said softly. You tell me when, not the other way around. She stared at the ceiling for a long time after that, one hand resting over her belly. The baby stirred, a soft flutter like wings brushing her from the inside. She whispered, "We're safe," and didn't cry. Not this time. The days passed in a haze of quiet joy and cautious healing. Paul helped her adjust to Earth's gravity again. He cooked for her, badly but with so much effort she couldn't help but laugh. He took her to the local clinic, where she saw a human doctor who didn't flinch at her physiology. "Life is life," the woman had said, scanning the pulse of the child with practiced hands. "And this one's strong." They went to prenatal classes together, though they were the most unusual pair in the room. Him tall and solid, her still slightly too thin, with glowing violet eyes and a quiet intensity that turned heads. But no one stared rudely, and when Paul placed a protective hand on her lower back, she didn't flinch anymore. They decorated the nursery together in the spare room of Paul's house. She chose the colors, soft, muted greens and silver. He built the crib by hand, despite several mild injuries along the way. Every time he cursed, she smiled and handed him the tool he'd just dropped. One morning he brought her a box. Inside was a tiny baby blanket made of a blend of earth fabric and something she recognized from her homeworld. A woven braid of sky fiber, faintly iridescent. "I asked some traders," he said, "told them what to look for." She held it like it was made of starlight. Her hands trembled. No one had done something like that for her since before the war. That night she kissed him. Not out of gratitude, not out of need, but because she wanted to, because she finally believed he saw her not as someone broken, not as someone to protect, but as someone to walk beside. They didn't say the word love, not yet, but it was there, in the space between their fingers when they sat together in the garden, in the way he tilted his head when she spoke, like every word mattered, in the way she stopped bracing for goodbye every time he left the room. It was a different kind of war now. A quiet one, against memory, against fear, against the part of her that still asked if she was allowed to be happy. One evening, as they stood on the balcony watching the sun dip behind the cliffs, Paul wrapped his arms around her from behind. Her belly was round now, and he rested his hands there with a kind of reverence. "You know," he said, "I used to think I had it all figured out, that I knew what kind of life I wanted. Then I found you lying in the dirt on a planet no one was supposed to care about, and everything changed." She tilted her head against his shoulder. "And now?" He kissed her temple. "Now I just want to see what the future looks like. With you." She turned to face him, and before she could reply, he kissed her. It was deeper this time, more certain. A slow burn rather than a spark. It wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last, but it felt like the first one that meant forever. When they broke apart, she whispered, "Then let's find out together." And Paul smiled, because for the first time since they met, there were no walls between them. No more war, no more half-spoken fears. Just two people finally walking towards something instead of away from everything. And above them, the sky of Earth stretched wide and open, waiting. The day their daughter was born began quietly, with a sunrise that painted the sky in streaks of fire orange and soft lavender. Irian had always been awake early since arriving on Earth, but that morning there was a different kind of stillness in the air, a weighted hush like the world itself was holding its breath in anticipation. She felt it before she could name it, a slow tightening low in her abdomen, dull at first, then persistent. She shifted beneath the blankets of their bed, pressing a palm to the crest of her stomach. The baby moved in response, a strong, tumbling flutter that felt like a hello and a goodbye all at once. Paul stirred beside her. He didn't open his eyes immediately, but his arm instinctively reached for her, fingers grazing her side. "Irie?" His voice was thick with sleep. She hesitated only a moment before answering, calm but certain. "It's time." That woke him completely. He sat up in an instant, eyes sharp, wide awake and already calculating. Okay, no panic. Let me call the clinic." She almost laughed. He had trained for everything. Survival missions, combat response, deep space emergencies. But the idea of delivering a baby still made him trip over his own feet. Yet he moved efficiently, grabbing the overnight bag they'd packed 2 weeks earlier, checking the comm for transport confirmation, offering her a hand as she eased herself upright with a deep breath. The pain hadn't overwhelmed her yet. That would come later. For now, it was just the steady reminder that something extraordinary was about to happen. The ride to the birthing center was brief, but every moment seemed to stretch like elastic. She stared out the shuttle's side window, watching the land pass in a blur of green and gold, the rising sun warming the hills. Paul sat across from her, knees bouncing, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm against his thigh. He caught her watching him and tried to smile. "You okay?" She nodded. "Scared, but ready." His gaze softened. He leaned forward, taking her hand in both of his. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." And he didn't. He stayed through it all. The hours passed in waves, first tolerable, then sharp and unforgiving. The clinic's med techs monitored her closely, adjusting her position, checking her vitals, offering assistance but never pressure. They respected her wishes, her voice, her space. Paul remained close, holding her hand when she needed him, stepping back when she didn't. His presence anchored her, even when the pain made her cry out, even when her breath came in short, uneven gasps. She had screamed once, just once, when the final contraction hit, and her body felt like it was being pulled apart. But then came a rush of warmth and a sudden silence followed by a cry, the most perfect sound in the universe. Not loud, not piercing, just a soft, desperate wail, the kind that made something inside her break open and flood with light. The baby, their baby. The nurse handed her a small, squirming bundle wrapped in woven white cloth. A quiet hush fell over the room. Irian stared down at her daughter, breath caught in her throat. The child's skin was a dusky violet, somewhere between her own and Paul's tones. Her eyes, still squinting shut from the strain of birth, would likely lighten, though to what color, no one could guess. Her hair, fine and silken, held a shimmer of silver beneath the light. Tiny fingers reached upward, grasping at nothing and everything. Irian couldn't stop crying. She didn't sob. The tears just came, silent and steady, running down her cheeks as she held her daughter against her chest and felt the warmth of her heartbeat, soft and rapid like the wings of a tiny bird. Paul stood beside her, his hands trembling as he reached out, brushing a fingertip gently across their daughter's brow. His voice was raw when he spoke. "She's perfect." Irian nodded, unable to speak. Then he looked at her, not the baby, but her, and in his eyes was something she had never seen on any battlefield, in any shelter, or on any ship fleeing death. Peace. And gratitude so deep it made his next words tremble. "Thank you," he whispered, "for her, for everything." She smiled through her tears and whispered back, "We made her. We brought her here." They named her Hope, not just because she was the symbol of something new, but because she was the living proof that they had survived, that after all the fear, after all the pain and loss, something beautiful had taken root. The nurses gave them time alone, and Irian fell asleep with Hope resting on her chest. Paul sitting quietly at her side, his fingers never far from both of them. When she woke a few hours later, he was still there, head resting against her arm, one hand curled protectively near the child's leg. Over the next few days, their home shifted to accommodate this new life. The house, once quiet, filled with new sounds, soft cries in the middle of the night, warm lullabies hummed half asleep, gentle murmurs shared in the dark. They were a family now, not just in words or intention, but in rhythm. Paul, to no one's surprise, became a devoted father. He read every parenting manual he could download, took notes at every checkup, and learned how to change diapers with the precision of a trained technician. But it wasn't the technical care that struck Irian. It was the way he looked at Hope, as if he still couldn't quite believe she was real, as if he were afraid to blink and find she'd vanished. One night, while rocking Hope to sleep, Irian said softly, "You love her like she's your own." Paul met her gaze and replied without hesitation, "She is my own." They didn't need DNA or matching features. What bound them was something deeper, something earned. Irian felt something shift inside her that night, a quiet release of fear, a final trembling sigh of relief. Her daughter was safe, She was safe, and Paul, this strange, grounded, stubbornly kind human, wasn't just part of her story anymore. He was her story now, their story. The birth of hope wasn't the end of something. It was a beginning, a quiet chapter opening to a future neither of them had dared dream about when they first met among the ruins. But here they were, and with every small cry, every smile, every moment of unspoken tenderness, they wrote a new sentence together, one filled not with war or pain or desperation, but with love. 3 years had passed, 3 full revolutions of Earth around its sun since the day Irian whispered, "Please save my child," into the scorched air of a dying world. That moment had become a distant echo, one that still lived quietly beneath her skin. But the woman she was back then felt like a shadow now. Familiar, yes, but separate, worn and hollowed compared to the woman she had become. Now her mornings started with small feet thumping across the wooden floor, the high-pitched squeal of laughter echoing through the house like sunlight pouring through windows. Hope, their daughter, was 3 years old and filled every inch of their home with life. She was quick like her father and stubborn like her mother. Her favorite word was why, and she wielded it with relentless curiosity. Her silver-laced hair shimmered whenever she moved, wild, untamable, and her eyes had taken on a striking lilac hue, brighter than Irian's but just as intense. She asked 100 questions a day and answered twice as many herself. "Are stars made of dreams?" she'd asked the night before, curled into Irian's lap as Paul read from one of her favorite storybooks. "Some say they are," Irian had replied with a smile, brushing a soft curl from her daughter's cheek. "And where did I come from?" Hope asked then, blinking up with such fierce innocence it made Irian's breath catch. Paul had answered that one, closing the book with a gentle thud. "You came from love, the kind strong enough to survive a war." Hope seemed satisfied with that, and in truth so was Irian. Their life had become a rhythm, steady and sacred. Weekdays were spent tending the garden they'd built behind their home, with hybrid crops and native flowers that grew in vivid bursts of color. Paul had turned a corner of their small shed into a lab of sorts, one where he experimented with environmental adaptation tech, sometimes bringing Hope along and letting her help by pressing buttons or holding light meters. Irian worked at the Cultural Liaison Center in town, helping off-world refugees settle into their new lives. There was a quiet kind of satisfaction in the work, being the one to say you're safe now and truly mean it. Sometimes she saw glimpses of her old self in the women who walked through those doors, guarded, exhausted, waiting for kindness like it was a trap. She always gave it anyway. Evenings were sacred, dinner together, story time, warm baths, sleep. And once Hope was tucked in, the world softened again. Just the two of them, Paul and Irian, sitting beneath the stars they no longer feared. And yet, for all that peace and simplicity, nothing could have prepared her for the moment she saw that small glowing confirmation on the clinic monitor. Pregnant. Her own breath caught as the word settled in her chest like a stone, not heavy with dread, but dense with meaning. The air around her seemed to pause, her heart beating louder than the soft clicks of the medical scanner. The doctor, human, kind, and familiar, was explaining hormone levels and health markers, but Irian barely heard her. All she could see was the single image on the screen, a tiny flicker, a heartbeat, another child. This one, Paul's. She didn't cry, not then, not even on the ride home, though the shuttle's windows blurred from a soft spring drizzle, and the baby inside her felt like a secret flame lighting her from within. She found Paul in the garden, knee-deep in soil and tangled roots, trying to coax a fragile vine into blooming. He looked up, dirt smudging one cheek, his smile crooked and effortless. "You're early," he said, wiping his hands on a towel as he walked over. She said nothing at first, only reached for his wrist and gently pressed his palm to her stomach. He blinked, once, then again. Then the weight of it hit him. "No," he breathed. "Yes," she said, the single word like a breath of wind before a storm. His reaction was quiet, stunned, hands trembling slightly as he held her close, his forehead resting against hers. He didn't ask if she was sure. He trusted her. He didn't ask how far along she was. It didn't matter. What mattered was the quiet miracle happening between them. Paul kissed her then, in the middle of the garden, under a sky streaked with fading gold. Not rushed, not dramatic. Just two people who had already chosen each other, doing so again. They told Hope that evening, over dinner. "Do you remember how you asked where you came from?" Paul said, nudging a spoonful of her favorite stew across the table. She nodded, already suspicious. "You said I came from love." Paul grinned. "Well, your little brother or sister is coming from the same love." Hope blinked. Then her eyes went wide and she gasped. "I'm going to be a big sister?" "Yes," Irian whispered, heart full. Hope screamed with joy, flinging herself into her mother's arms and declaring, "I will protect the baby forever." And somehow Irian believed her. That night, after Hope had finally fallen asleep, still whispering promises to her future sibling through the soft fabric of her pillow, Irian sat beside Paul in their room, a warm blanket wrapped around both of them. Her head rested on his chest, and for a long time, they said nothing. Then she whispered, 3 years ago, I didn't think I'd survive the week." "I know," he said, his hand resting gently on her belly. "And now?" He finished for her. "Now you're more alive than you've ever been." She looked up at him, a quiet smile pulling at the corners of her lips. "It wasn't the stars or the rescue ship or even Earth that saved me." "I know," Paul replied, brushing his thumb along her cheek. "It was you." She shook her head softly. "It was us." And she meant it, because now there were no ghosts left clinging to the edges of her memories, no fears that woke her in the night. The past would always be part of her, but it no longer defined her. She was a partner, a mother, a woman who had chosen love not once, but again and again, even when it had seemed impossible. Their home wasn't large, their life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And every time Paul walked past her in the hallway and kissed the top of her head, every time Hope ran through the garden screaming with joy, every time the wind shifted and brought the scent of soil and new life, Irian knew this was where she belonged. And when the new baby came, their home would simply stretch to make room, just as her heart had done again and again, growing around grief, around joy, around the impossible beauty of a life rebuilt from ruin. She thought sometimes about that desolate planet, the scorched dust, the biting wind, the moment she whispered a dying plea into an uncaring sky. "Please, save my child." Now, years later, holding Paul's hand and watching Hope sleep with a smile on her tiny face, Irian knew that plea had become a promise, and that promise had become a future. Love had found her in the unlikeliest of places, and this was the life she never dared to dream, and it was real.